a lead projectile accelerating to 150 feet per second, delivered from 30 meters, with enough kinetic energy to fracture the frontal bone of a human skull on contact. That's not a miracle story. That's a ballistics report. Now, here's what makes it interesting. The weapon that produced those numbers wasn't a rifle. It wasn't a crossbow. It wasn't any piece of military hardware that took a craftsman months to build. It was a leather pouch attached to 2 cords, something a shepherd boy had been practicing with since he could walk. You've read this story 100 times. Maybe you've heard it 100 sermons, and every single time the emphasis lands in the same place. The faith, the 5 smooth stones, the giant who didn't see it coming. Those things are all true. But here's what nobody asks about this passage. What exactly happened to Goliath's skull the moment that stone hit it? And why was David, a shepherd, not a soldier, the only person in Saul's entire army who understood what a sling could actually do? Because when you run the numbers, this isn't a story about a boy getting lucky. It's a story about a military specialist walking onto a battlefield that everyone else had misread. Follow the military science here, and the miracle gets bigger, not smaller. Let's start with the weapon. The weapon everyone misunderstood. Forget everything you think you know about a sling. When most people picture David's weapon, they picture something roughly equivalent to a child's toy. A forked stick with a rubber band. That's a slingshot. What David carried was a sling. Completely different instrument. Completely different physics. And for roughly 3,000 years of recorded military history, the difference mattered enormously. A military sling in the ancient Near East was typically 60 to 90 centimeters of braided leather or woven plant fiber, 2 cords attached to a central pocket called the pouch. You load the pouch. You spin the entire assembly around your head, building rotational momentum. At the precise moment of release, and the timing is everything, you let one cord go. The projectile exits the pouch and travels in a straight line toward whatever your aim was pointed at when you released. Simple, except nothing about the execution is simple. Researchers who have studied ancient sling mechanics, including work cited in peer-reviewed studies on biblical-era projectile weapons, have clocked trained slingers releasing stones at between 100 and 150 feet per second. Some estimates from reconstructed testing go higher. For comparison, that's roughly in the same velocity range as a modern .45 caliber handgun round. The projectile is smaller, obviously, but the kinetic energy on impact, particularly against an unarmored or lightly armored target at the right range, was enough to cause catastrophic blunt trauma. Ancient armies knew this. That's the part that gets lost. The Assyrians trained specialized slinger units. So did the Romans. Their Balearic slingers from the islands off Spain were so feared that Roman commanders recruited them specifically as elite auxiliaries. So did virtually every major military power of the ancient world, because a trained slinger at range could kill an armored man, not sometimes, reliably. Do the math on what that means. If you're a general in the ancient world and you can put a projectile through 30 to 40 meters of air and strike a man in the head before he can close the distance, that's a standoff killing weapon. That's ranged precision lethality, against which most hand-to-hand infantry had very limited options. The Israelite army knew this too. 1 Chronicles 12, 2 records specifically that among David's warriors there were men who could sling stones with either hand. This wasn't a casual observation. The author was cataloging military capability. Ambidextrous slingers were trained assets, their skill worth recording the same way you'd record a unit's armor type or weapons inventory. So why, when Goliath stepped out and issued his challenge, did nobody in Saul's entire army volunteer? Here's where the military science meets the text in a way that most readings completely miss. The battlefield. Everyone misread. To understand what David saw when he arrived at the valley of Elah, you need to understand what Goliath actually was. Goliath's recorded dimensions in 1 Samuel 17 describe a man somewhere between 6 feet 9 and 9 feet tall, depending on which textual tradition you're working from. The physical scale is significant, but his equipment tells an even more precise story. The text gives us the numbers. Goliath's coat of armor weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. Convert that. Somewhere between 57 and 125 pounds of bronze-scale armor covering his body. His iron spear tip alone weighed 600 shekels, roughly 15 pounds. He had a bronze helmet, bronze leg armor, a large shield carried by a separate man walking ahead of him. Think about what you're looking at. Goliath was a heavily armored, heavily armed shock warrior. His entire military function was close-quarters combat. He was designed, equipped, trained, probably selected for his physical attributes from birth, to close the distance, get inside a defensive line, and kill in a confined space where his size and armor made him nearly unstoppable. Now think about the challenge he was issuing. He wanted single combat. He wanted one Israelite warrior to come down into the valley floor and meet him. And every trained soldier in Saul's army looked at the matchup and did the same calculation. In close quarters, combat against Goliath, there is no version of this where I survive. They were right. They were also thinking about completely the wrong kind of fight. Because here is what a shepherd who had spent years alone in the hills with nothing but a sling and a herd to protect understood intuitively about this situation. Goliath was not dangerous at range. He was almost immobile at range. 5,000 shekels of bronze armor meant Goliath could not sprint. He could not dodge. He certainly could not close 30 meters fast enough to avoid a projectile already in the air. His shield carrier walked in front of him, protecting him from frontal threats that came from ground level, not from a stone arcing through the air at high velocity, aimed at the one part of his face that the shield couldn't cover. Goliath had issued a challenge that assumed his opponent would fight on his terms. David was the only person in the army who recognized that Goliath's terms were irrelevant. First, Samuel 17:40 notes that David chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. Smooth stones are not accidental. Irregular stones tumble in flight. Aerodynamics matter even without modern physics language to describe them. A smooth, dense stone maintains a more predictable trajectory. David was selecting ammunition. He understood his weapon well enough to have a preference about the projectile. That is not the behavior of someone hoping for luck. And then verse 49, David ran toward Goliath. He didn't walk, didn't approach cautiously. He ran. Because every additional meter of distance he covered before releasing that stone increased the closing time on Goliath, reduced the angle advantage of the shield, and put him inside optimal sling range. Running toward the man everyone else was terrified of was the tactically correct decision. The aggressive move was the safe move, if you understood the weapon. The stone hit Goliath in the forehead. The text says it sank in. That specific physical detail, the projectile penetrating rather than merely striking, is consistent with what we know about lead or stone sling projectiles at velocity against human bone. The impact would have caused immediate structural damage to the frontal bone, almost certainly producing a fatal traumatic brain injury on contact or within seconds. Goliath fell forward, face down. Now here's a question worth sitting with. What this passage is actually about. The traditional reading of this story frames David's victory as evidence of what happens when human weakness is surrendered to divine power. That reading is correct, but it has sometimes produced a smaller version of the story than the text actually contains, because the God who orchestrated this moment did not send a child to get lucky. He sent a specialist. David had been in the hills for years, alone, responsible for sheep that wolves and lions actively wanted to kill. He tells Saul directly in verse 34 and 35, "A lion came, a bear came. He killed both with his hands when necessary, but the sling was the first line of defense." He was not recounting spiritual victories. He was presenting his combat resume to a military commander who needed to know whether he could handle this assignment. That resume included thousands of hours of sling practice, in varying conditions, against moving targets, under pressure, with real stakes. The ancient equivalent of a modern sniper's logged range time. And the specific skill he had developed, precision range targeting of animal predators, translated almost perfectly to the tactical problem Goliath presented. This is a pattern worth tracing through Scripture. Gideon's 300 weren't chosen by random lottery. They were identified through a behavioral selection test that Judges 7 describes precisely. Joshua's spies at Jericho weren't sent in blind. They were gathering intelligence about walls, military readiness, and internal morale. The biblical world did not treat military competence as the opposite of faith. It treated competence as the instrument through which specific faithfulness could be expressed. David's faith wasn't demonstrated by ignoring what a sling could do. It was demonstrated by trusting that what a sling could do was going to be enough, and walking toward a 9-foot armored warrior to prove it. The military science doesn't shrink the miracle. It clarifies what the miracle actually was. The miracle was not that an untrained boy got improbably lucky with a rock. The miracle was that the one person in that entire valley who had the specific weapon, the specific training, and the specific tactical clarity to see past Goliath's intimidation campaign was a shepherd nobody had thought to put on the front line. That's not accidental casting. That's a pattern. And if you're the kind of person who reads history looking for those patterns, the rest of David's military career is worth studying very carefully, because from the moment that stone left the sling, you are watching a commander in the making, someone whose tactical mind had been sharpened in the fields while everyone else was looking for him in the palace. The lost world of Scripture goes deeper into those systems every week. The military budgets, the campaign logistics, the weapons technology that powered the biblical world. If today's breakdown changed how you see this passage, subscribe and stay with us. There's a lot more where this came from.